The Ghost of Justice. In the sprawling expanse of Montana's ranch country, the Devil's Mayhem Motorcycle Club had cemented their reputation as an unchallenged force. They ran their illicit empire with a mix of cunning, violence, and intimidation, carving a path of fear across 3 states. Their leader, Vincent Romano, was as calculating as he was ruthless. No one dared to stand against them, until the night they kidnapped Victoria Kingsley. Victoria, to the outside world, was an unassuming rancher's wife. At 53, she carried the grace of someone who had spent years navigating the rhythms of the land, tending to livestock, mending fences, and running the family ranch with her husband, Robert. To the Devil's Mayhem, she was a pawn, a means to pressure Robert into selling the last piece of land they needed to control a key route for their smuggling operations. But what they didn't know was that Victoria was far more than the rancher's wife they underestimated. In her previous life, Victoria had been a legend in federal law enforcement, known as the Ghost. She was a master strategist and investigator who had brought down some of the most dangerous criminal networks in the country. Her name was whispered in fear because those who crossed her path rarely escaped justice. A decade earlier, she had stepped away from her badge, seeking a quieter life after the weight of her work had grown too heavy. But as the Devil's Mayhem would soon learn, ghosts have a way of haunting their enemies. Trouble brewing. It began with subtle signs. Motorcycles passing the ranch more frequently, unfamiliar faces appearing in town, and increasing offers to buy the land. Victoria had seen it all before. She watched with quiet determination as their patterns emerged, each move telegraphing their intentions. The Devil's Mayhem were testing the waters, and Victoria let them think they were in control. "Another one today," Robert said one morning, his voice heavy with concern. He set down his coffee mug, glancing at Victoria as she stood by the window. "Red Harley this time. Same patch." "They're closing in," Victoria replied, her voice calm but resolute. "They'll make their move soon." Robert sighed. "We could sell, you know. The money's more than fair." "It's not about the money," Victoria said firmly, turning to face him. "It's about justice. They've bullied and hurt too many people. If we sell, we're just feeding their empire." Robert nodded, trusting her judgment as he always had. Over a decade of marriage, he had come to understand that beneath Victoria's quiet demeanor lay a core of unshakable steel. Whatever was coming, he knew she would face it head-on. The trap is set. The day came sooner than expected. Victoria had just returned from town when she saw them, a convoy of motorcycles and SUVs kicking up dust as they roared down the gravel driveway. Robert stood by the porch, his fists clenched, but Victoria touched his arm gently. "Stay inside," she said softly. "No matter what happens, don't come out." She stepped onto the porch as the vehicles came to a stop. Romano dismounted his custom chopper with practiced swagger, flanked by his enforcers. His reputation preceded him. A former military man turned criminal mastermind. He exuded confidence and menace. "Mrs. Kingsley," Romano called out, flashing a wolfish grin. "We've come to make you an offer you can't refuse." Victoria crossed her arms, feigning nervousness. "This is private property." Romano chuckled. "Not for long. Your husband's land is the last piece we need. $2 million, Mrs. Kingsley. More than fair." "We're not selling," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sell the role of the scared rancher's wife. Romano's smile faded. "That's unfortunate," he said coldly. With a snap of his fingers, 2 enforcers grabbed Victoria, zip-tying her hands as she struggled convincingly. Robert watched helplessly from the window as the convoy drove off with his wife. He reached for his phone to call the sheriff, but paused when he saw the note Victoria had left on the counter. "Trust me. They just made their biggest mistake. Ghosts don't forget." At the Devil's Mayhem warehouse, Victoria found herself tied to a chair, surrounded by armed men. Romano loomed over her, confident in his power. "You're going to convince your husband to sell," he sneered. Otherwise, things might get messy. Victoria let the fear show on her face, but internally assessed the situation. The layout of the warehouse, the positions of the guards, the visible exits, everything was cataloged in her mind. She had been in tighter spots before. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice trembling. "Robert won't sell." Romano laughed. "Then he'll watch as we burn his precious ranch to the ground." As the night wore on, Victoria began to play her game. She spoke just enough to sow doubt among the men, dropping cryptic hints that unsettled them. She mentioned details no outsider should know about their operations, leaving them wondering how much she had uncovered. By the time dawn broke, the cracks in their confidence were beginning to show. And that's when the cavalry arrived. Justice delivered. The raid was swift and devastating. Federal agents, led by Victoria's old partner, Marshal Kane, stormed the warehouse, dismantling the operation with precision. Victoria had activated a hidden transmitter during her abduction, guiding the team to their location. The Devil's mayhem never saw it coming. Romano, cornered and defeated, glared at Victoria as he was led away in handcuffs. "You set us up," he spat. Victoria smiled, the ghost behind her quiet exterior finally revealed. "You set yourselves up. You were just too arrogant to see it." A new beginning. Back at the ranch, Robert embraced Victoria tightly, relief flooding his face. "I should have known you had a plan," he said. Victoria smiled. "They thought I was just a rancher's wife. Sometimes, that's all it takes to bring down an empire." Word of the takedown spread quickly, and Victoria's name resurfaced in whispers among criminals. The ghost had returned, and justice had been served. The experience reminded her of why she had chosen this life, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And in doing so, she taught the Devil's mayhem a lesson they would never forget. Never underestimate the power of resilience, courage, and quiet strength. The Ghost's Hunt. The fallout from the Devil's mayhem raid rippled across Montana's ranch country like a shockwave. Victoria Kingsley had returned home to the Double R Ranch, but the battle was far from over. The takedown at the warehouse was just the beginning. As the dust settled, whispers of larger players, shadowy figures orchestrating the entire operation from the shadows, reached her ears. Victoria knew this wasn't just about the Devil's Mayhem Motorcycle Club. It was about dismantling the empire they served. A trail of secrets. The morning after the raid, Victoria sat on her porch, sipping coffee as the sunrise painted the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. The quiet of the ranch was a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her mind. She scrolled through encrypted messages on a secured laptop Kane had delivered that morning. Each message was a piece of a puzzle. Transport routes, offshore bank accounts, and coded communications, connecting the warehouse operation to a larger international network. Robert walked out onto the porch, his face etched with concern. "You're not done, are you?" Victoria looked up, her eyes resolute. "Not yet. The Devil's mayhem was just a tool, a front for something much bigger. Someone is using Montana as a gateway, and they're counting on people like us to stay silent." Robert sat beside her. "You've already done more than anyone could ask. Can't Kane and his team take it from here?" "They'll do their part," she said, closing the laptop. "But there are pieces of this puzzle they don't have. Pieces I can find." "Then I'll help," he said firmly. Victoria smiled, placing a hand on his. "You already have. Just keep the ranch running and stay safe. I'll handle the rest." The Devil's Network. Victoria's first target was a name that had surfaced during her brief captivity: Caleb Voss. Voss was a financier with a reputation for laundering money through shell companies and overseas accounts. He wasn't officially tied to Devil's Mayhem, but his name appeared in their ledgers more than once. Tracking Voss meant leaving the safety of the ranch. With Robert's reluctant blessing, Victoria loaded her truck with essentials and set off for Billings, Montana's largest city. It was there that Voss operated under the guise of a legitimate businessman, running a high-end investment firm. Victoria knew his type well: Men who thrived in the shadows, protected by layers of legality and deniability. She also knew that they often underestimated those who came after them. A wolf in sheep's clothing. The posh office building housing Voss's firm was a far cry from the rugged Montana landscape. Victoria walked in, dressed as a prospective client. Her tailored blazer and carefully applied makeup blended seamlessly with the building's clientele, wealthy investors looking to grow their fortunes. Miss Kingsley, the receptionist, greeted her with a polished smile. "Mr. Voss is ready to see you." Victoria followed the young woman into a sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Caleb Voss stood as she entered, extending a hand. He was tall, with a practiced charm that bordered on arrogance. "Victoria Kingsley," he said warmly, "I've heard your family owns a significant piece of land near the Canyon Road corridor. Exciting opportunities in that area." Victoria shook his hand, her grip firm but not overpowering. "That's what I'm here to discuss. I've been hearing a lot of interest in that area. I thought it was time to explore my options." Voss gestured for her to sit. "Smart move. Development is booming. With the right investments, you could see a substantial return." Victoria let him talk, nodding at the right moments, her expression attentive. But beneath her calm exterior, she was studying him. His body language, his inflections, the subtle glances he exchanged with his assistant, it all painted a picture. He was hiding something. A careful game. After their meeting, Victoria didn't leave the building. Instead, she found a quiet corner near the elevators and pulled out a device Kane had provided, a compact signal interceptor. Within moments, she was accessing the building's internal network, scanning for Voss's communications. Her patience paid off. A flagged email surfaced, a message from Voss to a contact in Vancouver. The subject line read, "Route secured." The body detailed logistical plans for moving goods through Montana into Canada, using the same Canyon Road corridor the Devil's Mayhem had been so desperate to control. Victoria copied the message and sent it to Kane with a simple note, "Follow the trail." As she left the building, she knew she was being watched. A black sedan had idled near the curb when she arrived, and now it was following her. Victoria's pulse quickened, but her movements remained steady. She drove her truck toward a nearby shopping center, parking near a side exit. She slipped into the crowd, disappearing before the sedan could react. The net tightens. Kane's response came the next morning. "Good find. Voss is connected to an international syndicate. They're moving weapons, but there's something else. Biological agents, small quantities, but dangerous." Victoria's stomach churned. This wasn't just about smuggling or land grabs. It was a threat on a much larger scale, and the people behind it weren't just criminals. They were operatives, possibly tied to rogue state actors or terrorist organizations. She stared at the message, her mind racing. If the syndicate was planning to use Montana as a hub for transporting biological weapons, the consequences could be catastrophic. She had to act quickly. The final stand. Victoria coordinated with Kane to set up a sting operation. They would intercept the next shipment on Canyon Road, catching the syndicate's operatives red-handed. But it required precision and, more importantly, bait. "I'll drive the truck," Victoria volunteered during their briefing. Kane frowned. "It's too dangerous. They'll recognize you." "That's the point," Victoria said. "They think they know me. They think I'm a scared rancher's wife who got lucky once. Let them believe that. It'll make them sloppy." Reluctantly, Kane agreed. A night to remember. The night was moonless, the air heavy with tension. Victoria drove an unmarked truck loaded with decoy crates, each one rigged with tracking devices. She followed the route Kane had mapped out, her senses on high alert. Halfway down Canyon Road, headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. A convoy of SUVs closed in, their intentions clear. Victoria maintained her speed, waiting for them to make their move. They didn't wait long. The lead SUV sped up, forcing her off the road. As the truck skidded to a stop, Armed men surrounded her vehicle. "Out," one of them barked. Victoria complied, raising her hands. She let them take her, playing the role of a frightened pawn. But as they loaded her into one of the SUVs, she pressed a hidden button on her belt, signaling Kane's team. Minutes later, chaos erupted. Helicopters roared overhead, floodlights illuminating the scene as federal agents descended. The syndicate operatives scrambled, but there was no escape. Kane's team moved with military precision, neutralizing threats and securing the shipment. Victoria, still zip-tied, watched as the operation unraveled. The head of the convoy, a man she recognized from the flight emails, was dragged out of his vehicle, shouting curses. Kane approached her, cutting her free. "You did it," he said, admiration in his voice. "We did it," she corrected, rubbing her wrists. "But there's more work to do. This was just one shipment." Kane nodded. "Then let's finish it." A legacy of justice. In the days that followed, Victoria returned to the ranch, where Robert waited with open arms. The syndicate's network was unraveling, thanks to the information she and Kane had gathered. But Victoria knew this victory wasn't just about stopping criminals. It was about sending a message. Even in the darkest corners, justice can shine through. As she stood on the porch, watching the sunrise, she felt a deep sense of purpose. The ghost might have been a legend of the past, but Victoria Kingsley was far from done. She was just getting started. Shadows and revelations. The takedown of the syndicate's convoy along Canyon Road was a triumph, but Victoria Kingsley knew better than to celebrate too soon. The operation had revealed a sprawling network of corruption and crime, but she could feel it in her bones. Something larger was waiting in the wings. The syndicate had left Montana bruised but not broken. And like all wounded predators, they would strike back with a vengeance. A warning in the wind. 2 weeks after the Canyon Road sting, Victoria sat in her kitchen, reviewing new intelligence Kane had sent. Satellite images, intercepted communications, and financial records painted a picture of an organization struggling to adapt. The syndicate had lost a major shipment and critical personnel, but their leadership had remained frustratingly elusive. Another late night, Robert's voice broke her concentration. He stood in the doorway, a steamy mug of coffee in his hand. Victoria took the mug with a grateful smile. "Thanks. And yes, Kane's team is uncovering more, but we're still not seeing the full picture. Whoever is at the top is staying hidden." Robert nodded, pulling up a chair beside her. "And you're planning to go after them?" "I don't have a choice," she said, her tone firm. "This isn't just about land or weapons anymore. It's about stopping something that could hurt countless people." As they spoke, a sound interrupted them, the distant rumble of motorcycles. Victoria's expression darkened. She grabbed a pair of binoculars and moved to the window, scanning the horizon. "They're back," she murmured. Robert joined her, his jaw tightening as he saw the glint of chrome near the tree line. "How many?" "5, maybe 6, she replied. "Different crew this time. They're testing us again." "Should I call the sheriff?" Robert asked. "No," Victoria said, lowering the binoculars. "Sheriff Dawson's been compromised. He's been stalling Kane's investigations and leaking information. We'll handle this ourselves. Old ties, new allies." That evening, Victoria placed a call to an old friend, Eleanor "Ellie" Holt, a retired intelligence analyst who had once been her partner during her time as a federal marshal. Ellie had left the agency after a close call in South America, retreating to a quiet life in Colorado. But Victoria knew she still had her ear to the ground. "Vicky," Ellie answered, her voice warm but cautious. "It's been a while." "Too long," Victoria agreed. "I wish this were a social call." "Let me guess," Ellie said with a sigh. "You're chasing something big, and you need my help." Victoria chuckled. "You always did know me too well." Over the next hour, Victoria laid out everything. The syndicate's operations, their use of Devil's Mayhem, the Canyon Road sting, and the lingering gaps in the investigation. Ellie listened intently, asking sharp questions that reminded Victoria of why they had made such a formidable team. "I'll see what I can dig up," Ellie said finally. "But be careful, Vicky. If this goes as deep as it sounds, you're poking a very dangerous bear." "Wouldn't be the first time," Victoria replied. "But thanks, Ellie. I owe you." The hunter becomes the hunted. Days passed with no sign of the bikers near the ranch, but Victoria knew better than to assume they had given up. She kept her routine normal, but her vigilance never wavered. Cameras hidden around the property provided a constant feed to her laptop, and she maintained contact with Kane and Ellie, piecing together the syndicate's movements. Then, late one night, the cameras picked up something unusual: 3 SUVs parked on a ridge overlooking the ranch. The vehicles were dark, their occupants invisible in the shadows. Victoria's pulse quickened as she adjusted the zoom, focusing on the license plates. 2 were fake, but the third matched a vehicle registered to a private security firm with known ties to the syndicate. "They're scouting us," Victoria muttered. The ambush. Knowing the syndicate was closing in, Victoria decided to draw them out on her terms. She and Kane devised a plan to lure the operatives into a trap, using the ranch as bait. Kane's team would be stationed nearby, ready to strike the moment the syndicate made their move. The following night, Victoria left the ranch house lights on and parked her truck conspicuously near the barn. She sat inside, a weapon at her side, watching the surveillance feed. Just after midnight, the SUVs appeared, their headlights off as they crept toward the property. Victoria waited until the intruders were inside the barn before triggering the floodlights. The sudden illumination startled the operatives, who scrambled for cover. Kane's team moved in swiftly, surrounding the barn and cutting off all exits. "Drop your weapons." Kane's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "You're surrounded." The operatives hesitated, but when Victoria stepped into the barn, her weapon trained on their leader, they knew the game was over. The truth revealed. Under interrogation, the captured operatives revealed critical details. The syndicate's leader, a man known only as Harbinger, was operating out of a remote compound in Alberta, Canada. Harbinger was an ex-intelligence officer who had gone rogue, using his training and connections to build a criminal empire. Victoria felt a chill as she heard the name. Harbinger had been a ghost story during her time in federal law enforcement, a shadowy figure rumored to be behind several high-profile operations. Now, it seemed, the ghost would have to face her counterpart. Crossing the border. The next phase of the mission required careful planning. Kane's team coordinated with Canadian authorities to stage a joint operation targeting Harbinger's compound. Victoria, unwilling to sit on the sidelines, insisted on being part of the strike team. "I've come this far," she told Kane. "I'm seeing this through to the end." The final confrontation. The raid on Harbinger's compound was swift and brutal. The team moved with precision, neutralizing guards and securing the perimeter. Victoria led the charge into the main building, her instincts guiding her through the labyrinthine corridors. She found Harbinger in a control room, surrounded by monitors displaying live feeds from various smuggling routes. He turned to face her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "So, the ghost comes to haunt me," he said, his tone almost amused. "This ends here," Victoria said, her weapon trained on him. Harbinger shrugged, stepping away from the monitors. "You can kill me, but it won't stop the machine. Cut off one head, and 2 more will take its place." "We'll see about that," Victoria replied. With a nod from Harbinger, hidden explosives detonated throughout the compound, plunging the facility into chaos. Harbinger used the distraction to flee, but Victoria pursued him into the surrounding woods. The chase ended with a standoff near a cliff overlooking a raging river. "It's over," Victoria said, her weapon steady. Harbinger smiled. "For now." Before she could react, he leaped into the river, disappearing into the current. Search teams scoured the area, but found no trace of him. Harbinger had vanished, but his empire was in ruins. A new chapter. In the aftermath of the operation, Victoria returned to the ranch, exhausted but resolute. Harbinger might have escaped, but his network was shattered, and his power diminished. For now, Montana was safe. As she stood on the porch with Robert, watching the sun set over the rolling hills, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. "Think they'll stay gone?" Robert asked. Victoria smiled, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "They always come back. But so will I." The ghost had returned, and she wasn't going anywhere. Resurgence in the shadows. The weeks following the raid on Harbinger's compound brought a fragile peace to Montana's ranch country. The Devil's Mayhem Motorcycle Club was dismantled, its leaders in custody. Harbinger's network, though fractured, was still alive, its remnants retreating into the shadows. For Victoria Kingsley, the quiet at the Double R Ranch was a temporary reprieve, a moment to catch her breath before the inevitable storm. But peace never lasts long when dealing with the world's most dangerous adversaries. Signs of a new threat. One evening, as Victoria walked the perimeter of the ranch, she noticed something unusual. A drone hovered at the edge of her property, its small frame barely visible against the twilight sky. She tracked its movements, her sharp eyes following its path until it disappeared beyond the tree line. Back inside, she retrieved her encrypted laptop and logged into a private server Kane had set up for her. The drone wasn't a random occurrence, it was surveillance. Whoever controlled it was watching her, testing her defenses. She sent a brief message to Kane. "Drone spotted near the ranch. Likely syndicate surveillance. Harbinger's remnants regrouping." His reply came swiftly. "We intercepted chatter about reorganization. Several key figures from Harbinger's network are unaccounted for. Stay vigilant." Victoria closed the laptop, her jaw tightening. The fight wasn't over. It had just shifted to a new battlefield. A whisper in the dark. The next morning, as Victoria was tending to the horses, an unfamiliar truck pulled into the driveway. A tall man in his late 40s stepped out, his tailored suit and polished demeanor out of place in the rugged landscape. He approached cautiously, raising a hand in greeting. "Mrs. Kingsley?" he asked, his voice smooth but guarded. Victoria nodded, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Who's asking?" "Samuel Hart," he replied, producing a business card. "I work with a private intelligence firm. We've been tracking the same network you've been dismantling." Victoria studied him, her instincts kicking in. The name on the card might have been real, but the man in front of her was hiding something. And why would a private firm care about Harbinger's operations? Hart hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Because his network isn't just a criminal enterprise. It's part of a much larger geopolitical game. You've shaken a hornet's nest, Mrs. Kingsley, and the people inside it are very, very dangerous. An unlikely alliance. Reluctantly, Victoria allowed Hart inside. Over coffee, he explained that his firm had been monitoring Harbinger for years. According to their intel, Harbinger wasn't just running a smuggling operation. He was part of a clandestine group of rogue operatives, manipulating global conflicts for profit. Weapons, drugs, biological agents. They were all tools in a larger strategy to destabilize regions and create demand for their services. Harbinger's network was just one arm of the beast, Hart said, pulling up a map on his tablet. There are others. And now that you've disrupted his operation, they're reeling, but they're also regrouping. If they can't use Montana as a gateway, they'll find another way. Victoria absorbed his words, her mind racing. Why come to me? You've got resources, operatives. Why involve a retired marshal? Hart smiled faintly. Because you're the only one who's managed to rattle them. Your name is being whispered in circles that don't scare easily. They know you're a threat, and frankly, so do we. But we believe we can help each other. Chasing ghosts. Hart provided Victoria with a dossier on a man named Victor Arnaud, a French national suspected of coordinating Harbinger's remaining assets. Arnaud was a shadowy figure, known for his ability to operate undetected across borders. He had surfaced in Central America recently, moving funds and personnel to rebuild the network. If we take out Arnaud, we cut off their ability to regroup, Hart said. But he's slippery. You'd need to lure him out. And you think I can do that? Victoria said, her tone skeptical. I think you already have, Hart replied. Harbinger's network sees you as a wild card, a threat they didn't anticipate. If you make the right moves, Arnaud will come to you. Victoria leaned back in her chair, considering the proposition. It was a dangerous gamble, but one she knew she couldn't ignore. I'll need full autonomy, she said. No interference. Hart nodded. Agreed. But we'll provide support when needed. Arnaud won't go down without a fight. Into the lion's den. The plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. Victoria would travel to Costa Rica, where Arnaud was rumored to be hiding, and establish herself as a credible threat. Hart's firm would provide surveillance and logistical support, but the operation's success hinged on Victoria's ability to draw Arnaud out of the shadows. Disguised as a wealthy investor with connections to Montana's land market, Victoria infiltrated Arnaud's network. She attended exclusive events, made subtle inquiries, and left breadcrumbs designed to catch his attention. Each step brought her closer to the heart of the operation, and deeper into danger. A dangerous game. After weeks of maneuvering, Victoria finally received an invitation to meet Arnaud at a secluded villa. The setting was opulent, a stark contrast to the gritty warehouses and remote hideouts she was used to. She arrived dressed in elegant yet practical attire, every movement calculated to project confidence and control. Arnaud greeted her with a polite smile, his sharp eyes betraying his suspicion. He was tall and lean, his tailored suit and polished manners masking a ruthless core. Mrs. Kingsley, he said, his French accent smooth and deliberate. I've heard much about you. All good, I hope, Victoria replied, her tone light, but her mind alert. Arnaud gestured for her to sit. Your reputation precedes you, the ghost who dismantled Harbinger's operation. Tell me, what brings you to my little corner of the world? Victoria met his gaze, her expression calm. Opportunity. Harbinger's fall created a power vacuum. I'm here to see who's ready to fill it. Beneath the facade. The meeting was a chess match, each word carefully chosen, each gesture loaded with meaning. Victoria allowed Arnaud to believe she was a disillusioned operative looking for a new cause. She spoke of Harbinger's flaws, hinting at her discontent with his methods. Arnaud listened intently, his interest piqued. But as the conversation unfolded, Victoria began to see cracks in his facade. He was confident, but not invincible. He relied on fear and manipulation, but his operation lacked the cohesion Harbingers had possessed. You're a fascinating woman, Mrs. Kingsley, Arnaud said as the meeting concluded. I hope we can work together. Victoria smiled. So do I. The trap springs. Unbeknownst to Arnaud, the villa had been under surveillance the entire time. Hart's team monitored every move, capturing critical intelligence on his network. As Victoria left the meeting, she signaled the team to proceed. The following night, the villa was raided by local authorities working in tandem with Hart's operatives. Arnaud was captured, his network dismantled in a swift, coordinated operation. The war isn't over. Back in Montana, Victoria stood on the porch of the Double R Ranch, watching the sun rise over the hills. Arnaud's capture was a significant victory, but she knew the fight was far from over. Harbinger was still out there, and the remnants of his network would regroup. But Victoria wasn't afraid. She had faced worse and come out stronger. The ghost was back, and she was ready for whatever came next. As Robert joined her, coffee in hand, she smiled. Another day, another battle. He nodded. And you'll win. You always do. Victoria's smile widened. Because I never stop. The ghost's reckoning. The victory in Costa Rica, marked by the capture of Victor Arnaud, was a significant blow to the remnants of Harbinger's network. Yet Victoria Kingsley knew better than to relax. Arnold's downfall would send shockwaves through the shadowy world Harbinger controlled, forcing new players to emerge and desperate ones to act recklessly. As she stood on the Double R Ranch, the crisp Montana wind brushing her face, Victoria's thoughts weren't on the quiet hills surrounding her. They were on Harbinger. She had seen the look in his eyes during their last encounter, the calculating confidence of a man who wasn't just surviving, but planning. And now, with Arnold gone, she suspected his plans would escalate. Echoes of the past. Victoria's suspicion was confirmed 3 days later when she received an encrypted message from Ellie Holt. The message was brief but alarming. Intercepted intel suggests Harbinger has resurfaced in Eastern Europe. High-level meeting planned with rogue operatives. Location: Prague. Time: 48 hours. Prague. The city brought back memories for Victoria. Her first major international operation as a federal marshal had taken place there. It was also where she had encountered Harbinger for the first time, though she hadn't known his true identity then. The irony wasn't lost on her. She immediately called Marshal Kane, who was still overseeing the dismantling of Arnold's network. "I'm going to Prague," she said without preamble. Kane sighed on the other end of the line. "You don't even have to ask, do you?" "No," she said simply. "I'm not waiting for Harbinger to strike first." Kane paused. "We'll coordinate from here, but Vicky, be careful. If he's calling a meeting, he's ready for a fight." Victoria smiled faintly. "So am I." The web tightens. Prague was as beautiful as Victoria remembered, its cobblestone streets and historic architecture creating an almost dreamlike backdrop. But beneath the city's charm was a network of secrets, hidden passageways, encrypted communications, and clandestine rendezvous. This was a city that thrived in shadows, and Victoria had learned long ago how to navigate them. Her first stop was an old contact, a Czech intelligence officer named Thomas Novk. They had worked together years ago, and though he had retired, his connections remained strong. "Victoria," Thomas said as they met in a quiet cafe near Charles Bridge, "I heard rumors that you were back in the game. Now I see they're true." "Not by choice," she replied, taking the seat. "I need information. Harbinger is here." Thomas leaned back, his expression serious. "He's been meeting with dangerous people. Weapons dealers, cybercriminals, even rogue elements within European intelligence. Whatever he's planning, it's big." Victoria's mind raced. Harbinger wasn't just regrouping. He was building something new, something more dangerous than ever. "Do you have a location for his meeting?" Thomas slid a piece of paper across the table. "Tomorrow night. An abandoned theater in Ziskov. But be careful, Victoria. He'll have security everywhere." "Good," she said, pocketing the paper. "So will I." Setting the stage. Victoria spent the next 24 hours preparing. With Thomas's help, she scouted the theater, identifying entry points, vantage spots, and escape routes. The building was a fortress, guarded by mercenaries and outfitted with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. She contacted Kane, who had been coordinating with international agencies. "I need a distraction," she told him. "Something loud enough to draw their attention, but subtle enough to avoid tipping Harbinger off." Kane chuckled. "You always did ask for the impossible. Give me a few hours." By nightfall, everything was in place. Victoria, dressed in black tactical gear, moved through the shadows like a wraith. Her target wasn't just Harbinger. It was the information he carried. Whatever plans he was orchestrating would be buried in encrypted files, and she intended to extract them. The meeting. The theater's grand hall, once filled with the sounds of music, was now a staging ground for Harbinger's operation. Victoria watched from a concealed perch as men and women gathered around a table laden with maps, laptops, and documents. Harbinger stood at the center, his commanding presence unmistakable. "Good," she said, pocketing the paper. "So will I." Setting the stage. Victoria spent the next 24 hours preparing. With Thomas's help, she scouted the theater, identifying entry points, vantage spots, and escape routes. The building was a fortress, guarded by mercenaries and outfitted with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. She contacted Kane, who had been coordinating with international agencies. "I need a distraction," she told him. Something loud enough to draw their attention, but subtle enough to avoid tipping Harbinger off. Kane chuckled. "You always did ask for the impossible. Give me a few hours." By nightfall, everything was in place. Victoria, dressed in black tactical gear, moved through the shadows like a wraith. Her target wasn't just Harbinger, it was the information he carried. Whatever plans he was orchestrating would be buried in encrypted files, and she intended to extract them. The meeting. The theater's grand hall, once filled with the sounds of music, was now a staging ground for Harbinger's operation. Victoria watched from a concealed perch as men and women gathered around a table laden with maps, laptops, and documents. Harbinger stood at the center, his commanding presence unmistakable. "Phase 1 begins next week," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "Our assets are in place, and the shipments are secured. The disruption caused by Arnaud's capture has been mitigated." Victoria's breath caught. Phase 1. Shipments. Whatever Harbinger was planning, it was already in motion. As she watched, a faint vibration in her earpiece signaled Kane's distraction. Across the street, an abandoned warehouse suddenly erupted in flames, the fire consuming the night sky. Harbinger's guards scrambled to investigate, leaving the theater vulnerable. Victoria moved swiftly, descending from her perch and slipping into the hall. She approached the table, her movements silent, her weapon ready. Harbinger, engrossed in his plans, didn't notice her until she was mere feet away. "Well," he said, turning to face her, a wry smile on his lips. The ghost herself. A deadly dance. The room erupted into chaos as Harbinger's remaining guards lunged toward her. Victoria moved like a storm, quick, precise, and unrelenting. She neutralized 2 guards with calculated strikes before taking cover behind a pillar. "Victoria," Harbinger called out, his tone mocking. "You should have stayed in Montana. This is bigger than you." She ignored his taunts, focusing on the guards closing in. With practiced efficiency, she disarmed and incapacitated them, leaving only Harbinger standing. He held a small device in his hand, a remote detonator, its red light blinking ominously. "You're too late," he said. "Even if you kill me, the plan moves forward." Victoria leveled her weapon at him. "Then let's make sure you're not around to see it." The final move. Before Harbinger could react, Victoria fired, hitting his hand and sending the detonator flying. He howled in pain, clutching his wrist as she advanced on him. "You've lost," she said, her voice cold. "Your network, your operatives, your plans. It's over." Harbinger glared at her, his defiance undimmed. "You think this ends with me? There are others. You'll never stop us all." "Maybe not," she admitted, "but I'll die trying." As reinforcements arrived, Kane's team and local authorities, Harbinger was subdued and taken into custody. Victoria stood amidst the wreckage, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. The ghost's legacy. With Harbinger captured, his network began to collapse. The intelligence Victoria had gathered led to arrests across Europe, dismantling the infrastructure that had allowed his operations to thrive. But she knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be another Harbinger, another shadow to chase. Back in Montana, Victoria returned to the ranch, her sanctuary in a world of chaos. As she stood on the porch, watching the sunset, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The ghost had struck again, and justice had prevailed. The ghost's redemption. The arrest of Harbinger sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld and corridors of power alike. The remnants of his network fell apart under the weight of coordinated international raids, and for the first time in years, Victoria Kingsley allowed herself to breathe. The mission was over. But as the dust settled, she realized her journey wasn't just about bringing Harbinger to justice. It was about rediscovering who she was. The return to normalcy. Back at the Double R Ranch, Victoria settled into the rhythm of ranch life once more. The early mornings, the smell of hay, and the sound of horses in the pasture were soothing reminders of why she had chosen this life in the first place. Robert was there by her side, his quiet support a steady anchor through it all. "You're different," Robert said one evening as they watched the sun dip below the hills. "Different how?" Victoria asked, her gaze still on the horizon. "More at peace," he replied. "Like you finally put down a weight you've been carrying for too long." Victoria nodded. "I think I have. I spent so many years chasing ghosts, fighting battles that never seemed to end. I didn't realize how much I needed to let go." A visit from Kane. A week later, Marshal Kane arrived at the ranch unannounced. He stepped out of his SUV, his suit dusty from the long drive, but his expression was warm. "Thought I'd see how the famous ghost was holding up," he said with a grin. Victoria chuckled, offering him a cup of coffee. "I'm not a ghost anymore, Kane, just a rancher." Kane raised an eyebrow. "A rancher who took down one of the most dangerous criminal networks in the world. That's a story for the ages." "Not one I'm eager to relive," she replied, her tone softer. "It's time to leave that part of my life behind." Kane leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've earned that right. But you know as well as I do that the world doesn't stop spinning. There will always be another threat, another harbinger." Victoria met his gaze. "Maybe. But the world has other people to fight those battles. My time as the ghost is over." Kane nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Then enjoy this peace, Vicky. You've more than earned it." A lesson in resilience. One afternoon, as Victoria repaired a fence line on the ranch, a group of local teenagers approached her. They had heard the stories, though the details were shrouded in rumor and speculation. To them, Victoria was a legend, a larger-than-life figure who had stood up against impossible odds. "How did you do it?" one of them asked, awe in his voice. "How did you stop them?" Victoria paused, leaning on the fence post. "It wasn't about stopping them," she said. "It was about standing up for what's right. Sometimes, the biggest battles aren't about strength or skill. They're about courage. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared, even when the odds are against you." Another teen asked, "But weren't you afraid?" "Always," Victoria admitted with a small smile. "Fear isn't the enemy. It's what keeps you sharp, what reminds you that what you're doing matters. The key is not letting it control you." The teenagers nodded, her words resonating with them. As they walked away, Victoria felt a spark of hope. Maybe the future didn't need another ghost. Maybe it just needed people willing to stand up when it mattered. A new beginning. The seasons changed, and with them came a sense of renewal. Victoria and Robert expanded the ranch, taking in rescued horses and offering riding lessons to local children. The ranch became a sanctuary not just for Victoria, but for the community, a place where people could find strength and solace. Though the world still whispered her name in awe, Victoria knew her true legacy wasn't in the battles she fought, but in the life she built after them. She had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a better future. One evening, as she and Robert sat by the fire, Victoria reflected on her journey. "You know what I've learned through all this?" she asked. Robert looked at her, his expression curious. "What's that?" "That strength doesn't come from being unbreakable," she said. "It comes from being willing to rebuild yourself every time you're broken. It's not about never falling. It's about always getting back up." Robert smiled, squeezing her hand. "That sounds like something worth passing on." Victoria nodded, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt whole. And so, the ghost faded into legend, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, courage, and the quiet strength that transforms lives. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.